Medieval England was a land of abbeys. There were over 800 religious houses in England and Wales on the eve of the Reformation, 23 of them in and around London alone, plus over 100 in Scotland. Some of the largest abbeys were massive affairs and dominated town and country landscapes. They were centres of consumption and employment, and sometimes of pilgrimage. The larger Cistercian houses had been famous for sheep farming. Some of the big Benedictine houses had been important centres of learning and the arts, copying, carving, carpentry, music, painting, and illuminating manuscripts. This is Westminster Abbey. We associate it today with royal coronations and Poets' Corner and so on. But for many centuries, this was a large, thriving Benedictine community. You're looking now at the Abbey Church and some of the surrounding buildings. In its heyday, the monastery would have covered several more acres. Like many of the greater houses, this one had received generous benefaction from kings and queens, noble men and women, and humbler folk. So that, as well as having its servants and artisans and craftsmen to work on the abbey buildings themselves, this abbey, like the others, would have had a bureaucracy of stewards and bailiffs and receivers to administer lands, the estates, scattered over perhaps a dozen or more counties of England and Wales, and which made Westminster, like many other abbeys, among the largest landowners in the realm. And yet, within a mere 4 years, 1536 to 1540, the religious houses of England disappeared. Monks, nuns, friars were wiped off the map. How? Why? Well, before that, a preliminary question. What is monasticism? I'm standing now in front of a very remarkable building, Buckfast Abbey in Devon. There was a monastery here in the Middle Ages. It too was suppressed, dissolved in the 1530s. 350 years later, the monks came back, and there's now a thriving Benedictine community here. A medieval monastery has come to life again. I've been talking to Father Prior about the Benedictine life. Father Prior, what is a monk?
The common conception is of a fat, jovial character who enjoys the good things of life, or a pious wet who glides around constantly saying, "Peace be with you, brother." But in reality, the monk is simply a person who wishes to serve God and his neighbor by living under a rule in a community under an elected superior called an abbot. And we are Benedictines. We follow the rule of St. Benedict. The whole day is so arranged round a life of prayer, but the periods in between are very important too, because one of St. Benedict's precepts was that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and during the times when the monk is not performing the community prayer, he should be engaged in gainful work, which in itself can be a prayer.
How long have you been a monk?
I've been here about, first of all, 33 years.
And will you stay here for the rest of your life?
I hope so. Certainly we take a vow of stability in the Benedictines.
What does that mean?
That means that a Benedictine monastery is a home. We are a family under the Father Abbot. And we stay in the family home unless we're sent under obedience to help out in some other sphere. But Buckfast will always be my home, and wherever I go, I will always return here. And every professed member is a member of the family,
yes,
until the day he dies.
Great as was England's debt to Irish monks, we can start our story with this man, St. Benedict, who in the early 6th century founded a community of monks at Monte Cassino in Italy and wrote a rule that they were to live by. The Benedictines spread quickly across Western Europe to England, and later many new orders were formed: Cistercians, Carthusians, Augustinians, Brigittines. Then there were friars and military orders, and over half a dozen women's orders. So, by the end of the Middle Ages, England and Wales, and much of Scotland, were covered with religious houses. How did all this come to an end, and so swiftly? In the first place, monks, friars, nuns, and particularly monks, I think, no longer played the major role in the political, economic, and cultural life of the country that they had once enjoyed. Other people, other institutions, were performing many of their functions. They mattered less, in other words, than they had once done to society. Secondly, well, perhaps there were too many religious houses in England, and some of them were certainly badly underpopulated. I don't pretend for a moment that all monks and friars and nuns were leading exemplary, fervent lives. Certainly not. There were scandals. Many of the people in monasteries may have had only a small, if no, real vocation for lives that are difficult and special. Many of them may have been just dumped in religious houses by their families, or they went there because there wasn't much else to do. Also, certainly, the criticism of somebody like Erasmus, and before Erasmus, the Englishman Langland, will have taken its toll. Though exactly how many people read Erasmus is another matter. Later, of course, Protestantism would reject monasticism, the whole idea of the religious life, as wrong-headed, un-Christian, and so on. But when all is said and done, I think two crucial facts remain. The first is that it's quite misleading, I think, to have an idea of steady decline from some high point in, say, the middle of the 12th century to inexorable, inevitable disaster in the 16th. There may have been a lot that was imperfect in English religious life, but there was also a good deal of health and vigour and growth. For instance, a lot of monastic building was going on right up to the Dissolution. Here at Bath, this massive abbey church was finished just before the suppression. At Bolton, the monks were in the middle of a big building programme when the end came. And there were still old-style abbots around, like the formidable John Islip, abbot of Westminster from 1500 to 1532, a very energetic builder. Or before him, John Wethamstead, twice abbot of England's richest abbey, St. Albans, a man of affairs, humanist and scholar, who spent the equivalent in today's money of millions of pounds on building. And the second crucial fact, I think, is that while many people would have agreed that there was a need to weed out some of the more decrepit houses, the houses that had passed the point of no return, nobody in the early 1530s was expecting or wanting, or very few people were wanting, a total and complete suppression of monasticism as a whole. Perhaps that fact helps us to understand this first act for the dissolution of the monasteries, passed in 1536. You remember that by 1536, the Henrician Reformation was well underway. Papal authority had been repudiated, the royal supremacy established. So Henry was ready for the next move, an attack on the religious houses. However, if you look at this act, you'll see that it claimed in no way to be an attack on English monasticism itself, but rather a measure to reform it, to clean it up. It was aimed solely at the smaller houses which royal visitors, we would say today inspectors, had found to be such dens of vice that the king really felt he had no option but to suppress them. The inmates of these houses were to be transferred to larger monasteries, and those larger monasteries received very warm praise in this act. The act talked about the great solemn monasteries of this realm, wherein, thanks be to God, religion, that is, monastic discipline, is well kept and observed. So this act was apparently not a first step towards wholesale suppression. Rather, it could have seemed to look back to the well-known medieval practice of dissolving decayed houses which were past the point of no return. And after all, Wolsey had suppressed 29 of them in the 1520s. Could have seemed to look back to that rather than to be paving the way for a clean sweep. And even stout supporters of the old order, the old church, would have felt considerable sympathy, I think, with the alleged intentions of this bill. Moreover, the bill contained an important escape clause, allowing the king, if he wanted, to exempt any house from its operation. And finally, we've got to remember that Henry himself almost certainly came down to the House of Commons in person to make sure that the bill was passed. So the whole thing was very carefully stage managed. 3 years later, another act was passed for the dissolution of those great solemn monasteries after all. As a matter of fact, in the previous 18 months, and despite official statements that complete suppression was not intended, individual houses had been making voluntary surrender, whatever that means, to the crown. So that by the time the second act was passed, the majority of the great houses were down, and the act simply ratified a fait accompli. The last of the English religious houses, Waltham Abbey, surrendered in early 1540. So in 4 years, it was all over. There is no doubt that a lot of the houses, the small ones dissolved under the 1536 Act, and then the larger ones, a lot went down very easily indeed, almost at a puff. I'm at Tintern Abbey now, in the Wye Valley. That house was a Cistercian house. It was dissolved under the 1536 Act. And as far as one can see, it surrendered without any difficulty at all. The Crown agent simply moved in and the monks went out. The royal agents would have stripped the roof of its lead, pulled down staircases, and left the place uninhabitable. And what we see now, of course, 450 years later, are these haunting ruins. I suppose that if you were a community living in this remote, isolated village, you would have known little about what was happening in the outside world, known little about what was going on at Westminster, and understood less when the royal agents arrived, ordering you to go. Presumably, the monks would have got up in a rather bewildered way and simply left, without any chance to consult with their brethren in other houses, to plan any concerted action on the part of the order, and so on. So Tintern was presumably very vulnerable to swift, decisive royal action. Though many houses, as I've said, large and small, surrendered pretty easily, a lot did not. It's wrong to think of all English monasteries simply succumbing like a pack of cards. For example, about 80 of the houses which came within the compass of the 1536 Act, the smaller houses that is, paid an awful lot of money to the king and hefty bribes to Cromwell to be exempted from the operation of that act. Many took considerable pains to hide their possessions, including their lands, from the crown. Some of the larger houses fought very hard to survive. We must remember that the ultimate weapon in the crown's hands was death for anybody who resisted. At least 5 abbots were hanged at their abbeys, including the abbots of Reading, Colchester and Glastonbury. Henry used violence against some Franciscans. He used violence against the Carthusians. So you knew what was coming if you stood up to him. And of course, if you were compliant, there was often, for the abbot or the prior, a very generous pension, a large golden handshake. Three further things have to be said to explain how the crown got its way. First, when royal agents arrived at some of the larger houses to take their surrender, they virtually laid siege to them, bullying, cajoling, threatening, setting faction against faction, with the result that the morale of a house would be broken or its will to survive undermined. Secondly, there is no doubt that the Crown made full use of every opportunity to plant its own candidates as abbots and priors when elections occurred. Now, these rigged elections, for that's what they were, meant that the House surrendered much more easily than it would otherwise have done, and almost invariably surrendered very soon afterwards. And the third thing, well, the story of Evesham illustrates it. This is a letter sent by the monks of Evesham Abbey to Thomas Cromwell in early 1539. In it, the monks say they've heard that the king intends simply to alter and change monasteries like theirs by converting them into what contemporaries often called colleges, that is, communities of ordinary secular priests who would live very much like monks, run a school, as they already did, and do some preaching. Alter and change, not abolish. So they clearly think that the king's intention is merely to adapt houses like theirs to new religious purposes. And here they are, volunteering for that conversion. The monks themselves would stay put, the buildings would be unchanged, and it would be business more or less as usual. Many other communities thought that this was going to happen to them. So it was quite clear that Henry and Cromwell were putting it out that this was the plan. There was also talk of converting some of the larger monastic churches into cathedrals, and this did indeed happen at Peterborough and here at Gloucester, for instance. Since 2 other abbeys were also converted, albeit briefly, to colleges, it could have been thought that what was intended was wholesale conversion to new religious purposes rather than suppression and secularization. Now, there's a further twist to the story. Look at this document. It's the preamble to an act passed in 1539 at the very same moment as the act for the dissolution of the larger monasteries, empowering the king to set up those new bishoprics. This preamble was written by Henry VIII himself. That's his handwriting. In it, he promises all sorts of good things: schools, almshouses, poor relief, new roads, etc., which could result from the dissolution of monasteries. In that preamble, Henry clearly indicated that the new bishoprics were simply a foretaste of many other good things to come. Now, the bill for erecting these new bishoprics was rushed through Parliament just at the moment when the second act for dissolution of the monasteries was passed in 1539. The two coincided. So, when Parliament voted for the second act for the dissolution of the larger monasteries, the members would have been thinking, or many of them, that what they were approving, what they were voting for, was not suppression of monasteries and transfer of their lands to lay hands, but the conversion of monasteries to other, mainly religious purposes. They were disappointed. One might even say they were duped. And what about the monks of Evesham? Well, I'm at Evesham now. Apart from the large gatehouse and tower behind me, almost nothing of the Benedictine Abbey remains. Where a huge Benedictine house once stood, there is now a public park, and just a few fragments of a once great and famous house still stand. Thomas Cromwell oversaw the whole operation. But behind him, of course, was the king. Henry played a major role during those 4 years, thrusting and hustling at every turn. And what was driving him? The desire to be complete master in his own realm, resentment of clerical wealth and power, sheer greed. In those 4 years, there was appalling destruction of beautiful, sacred, and irreplaceable things. Buildings, stained glass windows, statues, shrines, vestments, church plate, libraries, organs. I agree that the king's subjects quickly joined in the plunder themselves. As soon as the dissolution got underway, the crown was besieged by requests from layfolk to buy or lease ex-monastic property. By the mid-1540s, what had begun as a trickle of sales had become an avalanche. But I would still contend that there was no sign of the appetite before the dissolution took place. That appetite was created by the opportunity. Supply created demand. The great risings of 1536, known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, were in large measure a lay protest against the dissolution. Some monastic churches survived, like Cartmel Priory. A bit of Pershaw's Abbey Church was saved, and most of Malmesbury's. At Tewkesbury, the citizens clubbed together and rescued the whole of the Abbey Church. But these were exceptions. In most cases, what wasn't ruined was converted to secular use. The new lay owners quickly set about turning houses of God into stately homes. Look at Laycock Abbey, for instance, which still shows clear signs of its monastic past, or Wilton, formerly a Benedictine nunnery, or Woburn Abbey, whose last abbot was hanged outside the abbey, and whose lands and buildings passed into the hands of one of the many families, the Russells, for whom the dissolution of the monasteries was to open the way to immense wealth. The transfer via the crown of the possession of the monasteries to lay hands was probably the biggest and fastest shift of wealth in English history. On the whole, the properties came to those who were already members of the possessing classes. In other words, Henry made the wealthy wealthier. A tiny amount went to schools and universities. For the rest, Henry did not honour his promises. The preachers, the colleges, the almshouses, the poor relief, the roads, and all the other things that had been promised were not to be. No wonder that the later Commonwealth men were to feel so betrayed and to cry out bitterly against what had been left undone. So English monasticism was effectively snuffed out by Henry VIII. During the reign of his daughter Mary, however, a small number of former religious houses, including Westminster Abbey, were restored, only to be suppressed a second time, of course, when Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558. All the same, even that didn't mark a complete breach with the past. Because, you see, a number of remnants of communities managed to stay together. A group of Bridgetine nuns, for example, lived secretly in England for several decades after Elizabeth's accession. Some more Bridgetine nuns and monks formed a community on the continent, and so on. By the end of the 16th and early 17th centuries, a growing number of English men and women, particularly women, were crossing the Channel to join new or found new Benedictine, Franciscan, Bridgetine and other houses to become monks, nuns and friars on the continent, in France, Low Countries, Spain, Portugal. This is Downside Abbey, near Bath. It began in the early 17th century. The community came to England in the end of the 18th century at the time of the French Revolution, and is now a large English Benedictine house and school. With its sister Benedictine houses, it can trace a link with the remnant of the last Westminster Abbey community, restored under Mary, and above all, it can claim to be direct heir to the great medieval English Benedictine tradition. It can trace its history directly back to St. Benedict himself, 1500 years ago.